Hello everyone, you're on my channel telling forbidden BL stories. This is the story of a royal Omega doctor who helped the queen during her pregnancy, but soon realized that the unborn child didn't carry the king's blood, but the blood of the royal guard, and he had to choose who to save, the baby, the crown, or his own life. Do not forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription, so you do not miss new forbidden BL stories that keep you up at night. Write in the comments which city you are watching this video from. In the highest wing of the palace, where the windows opened only onto enclosed gardens and never toward the city, lived the royal Omega physician. His name was Elian. Servants spoke it in a flat, practical tone, the way they might talk about a broom or a ledger. Nobles used it differently, wrapped in lowered voices and tight mouths, as if the syllables themselves might shift the balance of the kingdom. Elian was not just a healer. In a court obsessed with bloodlines, he was the one who measured what could not be seen, the keeper of the royal line's most fragile secret: fertility. His rooms were narrow, but every surface had a purpose. Shelves sagged under the weight of glass vials, each labeled in a precise, slanted hand. Boxes of carefully dried herbs sat beside powders kept in stoppered jars, more expensive than some soldier's yearly pay. Slim instruments, polished so often they no longer reflected his face, only a blur of light, lay in ordered rows on metal trays. He moved through this space without hesitation, knowing where everything lived, even in the dark. Every morning began the same way. He lit the lamps, checked the temperature in his storage, inspected the seals on volatile tinctures. Then he unfolded the parchment scroll that tracked the queen's readings and traced yesterday's ink with his fingertip, feeling the faint texture where the quill had bitten into the fibers. Every heartbeat he listened to, every hormone level he measured, could shift the direction of the kingdom's future by a degree that would only show years later. In a monarchy where the king had no living heir, the Omega in the White Tower was both necessary and disposable. He knew this as clearly as he knew the layout of his chambers. The king needed him, but only until that need could be satisfied. After that, an inconvenient memory could always be erased. Elian's own status was the kind of contradiction the palace was built on. As an Omega, he had been considered property for most of his life. He remembered hands on his shoulders when he was still a boy, turning his face toward the light so older physicians could examine his pupils, his posture, his scent. They had decided his future in a few measured phrases: good mental acuity, compliant, strong nerves, strong, suitable for training. From youth onward, he learned anatomy from wax figures and unrolled cadavers, alchemical medicine from texts chained to lecterns, pheromonal science from long hours spent recording the scent signatures of alphas who never bothered to remember his name. He learned to keep his own scent sealed down, neat and inoffensive, the way he kept his workspace. He was raised to serve the crown in the most intimate way possible, without ever being allowed intimacy of his own. As royal physician, he held authority over the bodies of those who ruled him. When he spoke in the clinical tone of his profession, even the king listened. Yet he had no authority over his own destiny. His freedom began and ended at the edge of the palace gardens. Beyond the walls lay a city he had only ever seen from a distance, a blur of rooftops and chimneys beyond the inner courtyards. Sometimes, on rare clear days, he saw smoke from hearths rising in uneven threads, and thought, almost guiltily, that somewhere down there people lived without knowing the exact shape of royal hormone charts. When the queen's long-awaited pregnancy was finally confirmed, the mood of the entire court tilted. Messengers were sent to the temples, bells rang under the pretense of a religious festival, but everyone knew the true reason. Years of tight-lipped anxiety about succession, about alliances that might fracture if the kingdom remained without an heir, softened for the first time into an uneasy kind of celebration. Elian had been the one to run the tests, alone in his tower laboratory before dawn. He remembered the faint shimmer in the reagent as it reacted with the queen's blood, the way the color shifted from pale gold to deeper amber. He remembered the click in his own chest when the numbers aligned. Conception. Successful. He stood for a long moment with his hand braced on the edge of the table, letting the reality settle. Then he wrote the result in his ledger with a steady hand, because the ink could not show hesitation. In the days that followed, he stood at the center of this fragile joy like a pillar of white stone. His name never appeared in any proclamation. It did not need to. Every noble who saw the queen's posture change, who noticed the new, protective way her hand lingered over her abdomen, knew that the Omega in the White Tower had become more important than ever. He saw it in their eyes when they crossed his path in the corridors: calculation, grudging respect, and a thread of fear. He understood the unspoken rule that came with it. If anything happened to the queen or her child, the first head to fall would not be crowned. It would be his. The thought did not paralyze him anymore. It had lived in him too long. It simply tightened his focus. It lived in the way he double-checked every measurement, in how he woke in the dark and found himself sitting at his work table, rerunning calculations that were already correct. "No errors," he would murmur to the empty room, to the rattling glass, to himself. "Not from me." In a palace built on ceremony and stories, Elian lived by protocols and numbers. They gave him the illusion of control in a life where his choices had always been made by others. He trusted variables that could be expressed in ink more than he trusted vows sworn in the great hall. From his window, high above the inner garden, he could see the king's guard drilling in the main courtyard. The lines of armored bodies moved as one, but there was always a figure at their center whose precision drew the eye. Sword cutting through the morning haze, stance rooted and balanced, Captain Rowan, the king's personal guard, was a familiar silhouette against pale stone. Elian had taken his vitals more than once after border skirmishes, had watched the rhythm of Rowan's heartbeat spike and settle on his instruments. He knew the irregular scar tissue in the captain's right shoulder, where an old wound had never quite healed, the faint asymmetry in his bone structure, the subtle trace of his unique alpha profile in the readings. In his ledgers, Rowan was a column of numbers and observations. In the courtyard, he was motion carved into flesh. At first, that knowledge seemed irrelevant to the queen's pregnancy. The king was strong, his genes prized by an entire dynasty. The queen was a carefully chosen political match brought from a neighboring kingdom to seal an old peace. On parchment, it was a perfect union. On parchment, all variables were controlled. Elian still believed in those controlled variables on the day he prepared the tower for the first full scan of the royal fetus. He washed his hands longer than usual, arranged his instruments in exact lines, and told himself, quietly, "The data will be clean." He did not yet know that the numbers he was about to see would break the neat symmetry of his world. The queen's pregnancy did not belong to her. It belonged to the crown. Every symptom she described, every slight discomfort she admitted under her breath, was written into a ledger Elian kept locked away. Her cravings were logged in neat ink, her blood readings charted on parchment pinned to his walls. Royal astrologers came with their own colored chalk, adding small star symbols beside his figures. Outside the tower, the capital erupted in declared joy. Taverns poured sweet wine, vendors sold ribbons in the colors of the royal house. Priests spoke about destiny. From above, it looked simple. Only those who lived near the palace felt how quickly celebration turned back into fear of what would happen if the heir failed. Inside, the air turned brittle. Ambassadors from neighboring kingdoms requested audiences, circling the same concern. Would this child lock treaties in place or shift the board? Behind carved doors, the royal council argued about regency clauses and what should be done if the baby arrived unfit to rule. Through vents meant for air, Elian caught pieces of sentences about succession and loss and knew that if anything went wrong, his name would be the first offered. His visits to the queen followed strict routine. He came at fixed hours, announced by a herald, while ladies in waiting adjusted curtains and then melted into the background. The queen lay against plain pillows, jewels removed, hair loosened, watching his hands with a desperate trust, as if each measured touch might be the only thing keeping her above the surface. She had been raised to be a daughter of her house, then a bride, and now a mother to a nation. Her body was only the channel through which that sequence passed. Elian saw the cost in the way her fingers twisted the sheets when a cramp caught her, and in the way her scent shifted when talk turned to the future, bright notes of duty thinning into a metallic thread of fear. His own hands worked with quiet precision. He felt shifts in hormone balance and tiny changes in uterine tone and adjusted her tonics without wasting words. The royal fragrance of her alpha blood was smothered under incense, but beneath it he smelled exhaustion, dread, and something he almost did not dare to name, a stubborn line of will. Each time he stepped back, the queen asked the same thing with her eyes. Will the child live? Will I? The king rarely attended these appointments. When he did, his presence pressed into the room like extra stone. He spoke in expectations instead of questions, demanding assurances no honest physician could give, and Elian answered carefully, promising diligence, never outcomes. The king's gaze lingered on him longer than on his wife, weighing the omega as he would a report from the front. One mistake, and you fall first. One evening, as Elian left the queen's chambers, he passed Rowan in the corridor. The captain stood at the doorway, a silent wall of armor and muscle. Torchlight drew hard lines along his jaw. His uniform was perfect, but there was a tightness at the corners of his mouth that did not match the formal stance. Elian's training had taught him to notice such details in patients, the slight tremor in a hand that meant more than fatigue, the narrowing of pupils, the way an alpha's scent flattened when they were holding too much inside. In Rowan, he sensed conflict held under iron discipline. For a brief, dangerous moment, he thought, "What burdens you, Captain?" Then he crushed the thought before it could grow. He could not afford to humanize those who stood at the edges of his duty. His world had to remain narrow, queen, fetus, protocols. Any deviation from that line could be fatal, not only to him, but to the life the whole realm demanded from this body. So he walked past Rowan with a small professional nod and told himself the guard was only another piece of the palace machinery. Yet that night, when he prepared the queen's next tests, Rowan's profile rose again in his mind, not as a soldier in uniform, but as a pattern in his records, the unusual coloration in his eyes, the slight asymmetry of his jaw, the rare alpha marker he had once noted in a margin simply because it caught his interest, a detail filed away and never expected to matter. Within weeks, the council wanted more than routine notes. They demanded proof that the unborn child carried the king's blood beyond doubt, and letters from allied courts echoed the same anxiety. Elian was ordered to schedule a full genetic resonance scan in the tower's deepest chamber, a test usually reserved for coronations, not for a fetus whose heart had only just learned to beat in rhythm. For the first time in many years, Elian's steady hands hesitated above his instruments. The request itself was not strange. The timing was. Somewhere beneath the stone floors, the kingdom's oldest magic waited to compare blood against blood. The chamber of resonance lay beneath the tower, carved into rock long before Elian was born. Its walls were inlaid with silver filigree that hummed whenever royal blood crossed the threshold. Here, lineages had been verified, pretenders unmasked, legitimacy carved onto stone. Elian descended alone, instruments in a leather case at his side. The air grew colder as he went down, smelling of dust and the faint metallic echo of old blood. He unlocked the door with a key and a murmured phrase, feeling the ancient magic answer under his palm. Inside, the chamber waited in stillness. A central stone platform reflected the lamps he lit. Around it, rings of amplification crystals stood in careful circles. Above, the sigil of the royal line watched in silence. He prepared the room with a precision that bordered on obsession. Each crystal was calibrated, then checked again. He adjusted the readers, aligned the resonance grid that would map the unborn child's pattern, and set it over the king's recorded profile. The result would not simply sit in a ledger. It would be written into the chamber itself. Officially, this test was meant to be a court ceremony. Before that, Elian had argued for a private preliminary scan, calling it a precaution. Better, he had said, to be certain than to risk an anomaly appearing in front of the court. In truth, he needed a moment alone with the data. Late that night, when most of the palace slept, the queen descended into the chamber. She wore no jewels, only a plain gown and a cloak against the cold, a single trusted maid behind her. Her heartbeat echoed softly as Elian helped her onto the platform. The sound was faint at first, then amplified by the devices he activated. For a moment, he placed his hand over her abdomen, feeling the subtle flutter of the fetus. Steady, he breathed, and did not know whether he meant the child, the queen, or himself. The resonance field came alive. Threads of pale light unfurled from the crystals, weaving around them. The field sank through flesh and bone, catching on the tiny lattice of the unborn child's code. Symbols bloomed across the monitors and over the inner surface of the chamber, like ink called out of hiding. He watched as the system began aligning the new pattern against the king's stored template. At first, everything followed the expected path. Major markers fell into place, inherited traits slid into their columns, the signature of royal alpha lines traced itself across stone. Then, the alignment stuttered. There was a hesitation in the field, a flicker that should not have been there. An error sigil flared and vanished, replaced by an overlay of two profiles instead of one. The primary template clung close enough to the king's to be plausible, but beneath it, like a shadow behind glass, another set of markers stirred and came into focus. It was not the blurred pattern of some distant ancestor or a harmless variant. It was sharp, specific, familiar in a way that turned his blood cold. Elian felt his stomach tighten as he isolated the anomaly. He pulled the secondary pattern onto a separate panel and forced the system to enhance it. Slowly, trait after trait rose out of the background, a rare marker tied to mismatched eyes, a particular arrangement of bone density in the facial structure. A pheromonal receptor array he had documented only once before. He did not need to consult the archives. Years earlier, in a routine scan after a battlefield injury, he had recorded the genetic profile of the king's personal guard. Captain Rowan's data had lodged in his memory as an interesting footnote. Now those same traits glowed on stone and glass, nested within the unborn child's code. His first coherent thought was not shock. It was calculation. If the system had detected this, any competent physician or seer with access to the raw data would see it too. If this trace remained, the public test demanded by the council would not simply confirm a pregnancy. It would expose treason in the royal bed. His second thought was more primal. If anyone discovered that he had seen this and chosen to conceal it, he would die for treason alongside whoever else the king decided to blame. Across from him, the queen watched his face. She could not read the symbols, but she could read the way his shoulders stiffened, the way his jaw set. She did not ask what he had seen. She did not have to. "Tell me," she whispered once, the words barely sound. Elian said nothing. His silence was answer enough. In that suspended moment, they both understood that something had appeared on those walls that could ruin them all. The child at the center of every prayer in the city was not what the realm expected. For the first time in his career, Elian reached for the controls with the intention not of recording what was, but of changing what others would see. Elian spent the hours after the secret scan in a state of controlled panic. He did not run. He did not collapse. He returned the queen to her chambers with the calm hands of a professional and the numb face of a servant who had learned, long ago, that visible fear invited punishment. Only when he was alone again did his mind begin to tear itself apart. Every vow he had ever taken replayed in his head as if someone were reading them aloud in the dark. Serve the crown, protect the royal line, preserve truth in medical records, do no harm, keep what is seen in the chamber sealed behind stone and oath. Each rule had once been a clean line. Now they collided with the image of those flickering markers nesting inside the unborn child's pattern, tying the queen's pregnancy to Captain Rowan like a thread of wire hidden in silk. At dawn, he climbed back to his tower, the corridors quiet except for the soft shuffle of servants beginning their day. The palace looked unchanged. White stone glowed under pale morning light. Banners hung perfectly. Golden emblems caught the sun like they always had. Yet Elian no longer saw stability. He saw cracks that had been there all along, hairline fractures disguised by polish. In his private study, he broke the wax seal on a narrow archive box and removed the tablet containing Rowan's original scan. His fingers hovered for a moment, hesitating as if the slate itself were dangerous. He remembered the day that profile had been recorded. Rowan had been dragged in from the training yard after a sparring accident gone wrong, unconscious from blood loss. Armor dented, hands slack, scent flattened by shock. Elian had scanned him to check internal damage and, by protocol, registered a full profile. Back then, it had been a line in a bureaucratic catalog, one more entry in a system designed to control bodies. Now those values might as well have been a confession carved into stone. He cross-checked the fetal pattern against the archived alpha profile, forcing his rational mind to do the work his emotions wanted to refuse. He wanted to find an error, any reason to believe he had misread the resonance chamber. The match returned again and again, indifferent to his hope. Not in every marker. There was enough overlap with the king's profile to fool a shallow reading. But in the deep markers, the ones used to settle dynastic disputes, the ones that made legitimacy feel like something measurable, the pattern held. Rowan's trace was there. Ilian's own history made the choice before him even more brutal. He had not arrived in the palace by talent alone. He had arrived by transaction. As a child, he had been purchased from an indebted Omega family and raised within these walls as property trained into usefulness. His education, his position, even the bed he slept in were reminders that the king could claim him as easily as the crown claimed the queen's womb. Serving the crown had never been optional. It had been survival dressed in ceremony. By saving the queen's secret, he would be betraying the man who technically owned him. By revealing it, he would doom the innocent life growing under the queen's heart and ignite a purge that would consume more than one household. Either way, he would be the first expendable piece in the fire. The physician in him saw the fetus as a patient, real as any soldier he had stitched back together in the infirmary. The citizen in him understood that the realm needed succession to avoid fracture, riots, and war between houses hungry for power. The Omega in him knew a colder truth. If he misstepped, punishment would fall hardest on him. The palace forgave alphas more easily. It used Omegas as proof of moral order. He began to map options the way he mapped symptoms, as if the situation were a disease with possible treatments. If he reported the anomaly, the queen would be accused of adultery and treason. Rowan would be executed, not for love, but for daring to touch what was not his. The child could be killed to prevent any future claim, or raised as a living humiliation under guard. The king would regain control through blood and fear, but the court would split along lines of outrage and opportunity. Rival factions would feed on the scandal, and foreign courts would smell weakness. If he concealed it, the kingdom would receive an heir believed to be royal, even though the bloodline would carry a forbidden deviation. The queen would live. The child would live. The king would sit on a throne built on a lie that could hold for years, perhaps decades, until one wrong resemblance, one betrayed record, one seer's suspicion turned it into an executioner's blade. The delayed explosion might be worse than the immediate one. Ilian stared at the numbers until they blurred. His chest felt tight, but he forced his breathing to remain quiet. In his head he saw Rowan standing outside the queen's chambers day after day, a silent wall of discipline and vigilance. He began to imagine scenes he had never allowed himself to imagine before. The way a gaze might linger when courtiers looked away, the quiet hours when duty thinned and human need pressed through. Somewhere between two men stood the queen, traded between kingdoms like a clause in a treaty. Somewhere between them all, a child grew, carrying an inheritance none of them had planned, none of them could admit. Ilian realized with sudden clarity that no decision would save everyone. The question was no longer whether to betray, but whom to betray first. He opened the resonance logs and placed his fingertips on the controls. His pulse beat loudly in his ears, as if the tower itself were listening. For a moment, his hand hovered. "Do not let them kill a child for pride," he whispered to the empty room. Then he began to rewrite the output for the public test, line by line, turning truth into something the palace could tolerate. In the days that followed, Ilian moved through the palace like a ghost who still cast a shadow. Outwardly, he remained the same. Calm hands, neutral voice, precise notes. He attended the queen at fixed hours, adjusted her tonics, marked her symptoms in his ledger, and nodded as council envoys requested updates that were never truly about her health. Inwardly, every corridor felt like a wire stretched too tight. Every glance carried weight. He had rewritten the resonance logs, but he could not rewrite what he had seen in the chamber. That knowledge lived behind his ribs like a second heartbeat. The captain of the guard became impossible to ignore. Rowan was everywhere, not because he hunted Elian, but because he belonged to the center of palace life the way stone belonged to walls. He stood posted at doors, led drills in the courtyard, passed in formations through arched hallways, spoke quietly with officers in corners. Elian moved past with his head lowered. Elian found himself noticing details with the sharp focus of someone trying not to think. Rowan's eyes, for example. One was a deep, steady brown, the other carried a pale ring around the iris, subtle but unmistakable when torchlight caught it. It had been noted in his medical file years ago as a hereditary marker. Back then, it had been a curiosity. Now it felt like a brand the world would eventually recognize. Elian began to sense Rowan before he saw him. The captain's scent was tightly controlled, disciplined like everything else about him, but there were undercurrents that Elian's trained senses still registered. Tension carried in the throat, stress held behind the sternum, a faint thread of something warmer that Elian refused to name because naming it would make it real. One afternoon, Elian was sent to inspect protective wards in a wing near the Queen's chambers. The palace claimed it was routine. In truth, nothing around the pregnancy was routine anymore. Elian walked the corridor alone, fingertips brushing carved runes embedded in stone, checking for disruptions in the binding lines. The hallway held sound strangely. Whispers lingered there longer than they should have. Behind a thick door, he heard the end of a conversation. The Queen's voice was low, careful. Another voice answered, deeper, controlled, with the cadence of an alpha used to issuing commands in battle rather than exchanging pleasantries at court. Elian stopped without meaning to. The door opened. Rowan stepped out first. He moved with that same precise economy Elian had seen in the courtyard, but in the close quarters of the corridor the details sharpened. A faint flush at the edge of his neck, quickly fading, a tightness around his mouth that did not belong to formal duty. The Queen followed, composed, chin lifted, but her cheeks carried the smallest trace of color, as if warmth had been dragged to the surface and forced back down. Their proximity was, on paper, explainable. Rowan was sworn to protect the royal family. He would speak with the Queen about security, patrol routes, threats. Yet the air between them held a tension Elian recognized from other contexts, the fine edge between restraint and hunger, between what was permitted and what was already done. Elian forced his gaze away and continued his inspection, but his hands shook once, a single betray of nerves. He pressed his fingers harder against the runes until the tremor stopped. That evening, when the palace lamps burned lower and the tower corridors emptied, Rowan appeared at Elian's door. It was an unusual breach of protocol. Captains did not visit Omega physicians without request, and they certainly did not come alone. Elian's first instinct was to pretend he was not inside, to let silence swallow the knock. His second instinct, colder and more practical, reminded him that ignoring the king's guard could be interpreted as defiance. He opened the door. Rowan stood in the narrow threshold, the tower light bleaching his uniform into gray-blue. His posture was perfect, but the tension in him felt like a drawn bow. Elian stepped aside and allowed him in, keeping his own expression neutral. Rowan's gaze swept the room with the wary focus of a man entering unfamiliar territory. Shelves of vials, instruments aligned with obsessive neatness, ledgers stacked with corners squared, sealed archives locked behind iron mesh. His eyes paused on them all, then on Elian, lingering a fraction longer than etiquette required, as if weighing him the way a strategist weighed an unknown variable. Elian felt the urge to speak first, to control the exchange, but his throat tightened. He could smell Rowan's restraint, fear hidden under discipline, not panic, not weakness, but the quiet fear of a man who knew what the king would do if truth surfaced. Rowan's voice came low, almost flat, the way soldiers spoke when they did not want walls to remember. Is she safe? It was not a question about the Queen's nausea or sleep. It was the question beneath all questions. How close was the edge? How far could they keep the kingdom from looking directly at the child's blood? Elian answered with the smallest truth he could offer. Her body is stable. The pregnancy is progressing. Rowan's jaw flexed once. He stood very still, as if motion itself might crack something. And the threats. Elian understood what Rowan meant without needing clarity. Threats did not only walk with knives, they arrived in documents, in councils, in rituals designed to expose lineage. They arrived as a king's suspicion. Elian chose his words with surgical care. The palace is watching more closely now. The council wants certainty. Rowan's eyes lifted, and for a moment the pale ring in one iris caught the light. Elian's mind flashed forward, uninvited, to a newborn face and those same impossible eyes. He forced the image down. The conversation that followed unfolded without confession, without names for what could not be named. Rowan asked about the queen's stress, about how fear could affect a pregnancy, about what would happen if she were pushed too hard. Elian answered like a physician, but every sentence carried a second meaning. Every careful phrase was a warning. At one point, Rowan's composure slipped just enough for something raw to show. "If they touch the child," he said, the words sharp and quiet, "I will not be able to stop myself." Elian felt cold spread through his chest. He did not doubt it. Rowan was a weapon trained for obedience, but even weapons bent when pressed against their own bone. Elian kept his voice low. "Then do not give them a reason to press." It was the closest thing to a plea he had ever given an alpha who could crush him with one hand. For a long moment, Rowan did not speak. He only stood among Elian's ordered vials and instruments, looking like a storm forced into human shape. When he finally turned toward the door, his shoulders were still rigid, but something in his scent had shifted, as if a fraction of his weight had been shared. At the threshold, he paused. "You are the only one who sees what matters," he said, and the restraint in his voice made the line cut deeper than any confession. Then he was gone, swallowed by the tower stairs and the palace dark. The room felt emptier afterward. Elian sat at his table and stared at his ledger without seeing ink. For the first time since childhood, he realized he had allowed someone to witness the edge of his fear. And Rowan, in turn, had allowed the smallest crack in his armor to show an Omega who, by court logic, should have been beneath his notice. From that day on, when Elian looked at the growing curve of the queen's abdomen, he saw more than the future of a kingdom. He saw the echo of a guard's impossible eyes reflected in the unknown face of a child, and he understood that whatever he chose to do from this point forward would be more than medicine. It would be a kind of judgment. The public resonance test could not be avoided. The council announced it as a solemn ceremony, a performance of transparency meant to reassure allies and intimidate rivals. Representatives from religious orders, noble houses, and foreign courts were invited. The results would be copied into the Great Codex and sealed for generations, as if ink could freeze truth in place. Elian approached the event the way a surgeon approached a forbidden operation, with hands steady and mind split into cold layers. In the days before the ceremony, he lived inside calibration tables and risk calculations. He altered the preliminary data with a discipline that made his stomach burn. He adjusted the resonance grid to emphasize markers the fetus shared with the king, burying the faint traces that pointed elsewhere. The modifications were delicate. They were not a wall, only a veil. They would survive surface scrutiny and fail under a deep probe, but Elian did not need permanence. He needed time, long enough for a child to be born alive, long enough to keep the king from acting on instinct while blood was still being measured. The morning of the ceremony, the palace sounded different. Footsteps multiplied, voices echoed in corridors that usually swallowed gossip. Servants carried banners and candle stands, priests rehearsed blessings, clerks prepared fresh parchment. Even the air smelled altered, heavy with incense meant to sanctify what was, at its core, a test of ownership. The resonance chamber transformed into a theater. Candles burned in iron sconces, their flames trembling each time a door opened. Banners hung from the walls, and the silver inlays along the stone floor glowed faintly, responding to the presence of royal blood before any machine was activated. Witnesses took their places along the perimeter, faces arranged into solemn masks, eyes bright with hunger for certainty. The queen entered first, escorted as if she were both sacred and suspect. Her posture was composed, the line of her spine carefully controlled. Only the whiteness of her knuckles on the armrest of the ceremonial chair betrayed the tension that lived under her skin. She did not look at the crowd. Her gaze went to Elian, briefly, a silent question held behind court-trained calm. The king followed with measured steps, expression carved from stone. He wore ceremonial black, the color of authority and mourning, as if he had already prepared himself for any outcome. He did not touch his wife. He did not need to. His presence alone filled the chamber, a reminder that every person here was inside the radius of his power. Elian stood at the console, the central platform between medicine and ritual. He initiated the scan with steady hands, because shaking would be a confession. When the resonance field activated, light unfurled in pale threads from the crystals, arcing around the queen and skimming the carved sigils on the walls. Symbols bloomed across stone like living ink. A low murmur spread through the witnesses, more awe than understanding. Most could not read the patterns. They relied on the officials stationed beside Elian, men trained to interpret the chamber's language and translate it into certainty. Among those officials stood a visiting seer physician from the queen's homeland, appointed by her family to ensure their daughter was not used and discarded. His presence was polite insult dressed as diplomacy, a reminder that Elian's authority was not absolute. The foreign physician watched the symbols with narrowed eyes, his face too still, as if he listened not only with sight, but with instincts sharpened by court scandals. Elian felt that gaze like pressure against his throat. The system ran its sequence. The fetus's pattern mapped itself across the chamber. The king's recorded template rose to meet it. For a moment, Elian's mind screamed, expecting the hidden trace to break through. But the veil held. The alignment projected its verdict in the ancient language of the court, and the primary markers fell within acceptable range. A restrained wave of relief moved through the room. Some witnesses relaxed as if released from a shared breath. Priests murmured approval. Clerks bent over parchment, recording the result with reverent strokes. The king's eyes softened by a fraction, not into warmth, but into satisfaction. Control restored. Doubt buried. The foreign seer physician did not relax. He stepped closer to the inscriptions, studying the light like a man examining a wound for signs of infection. His lips pressed into a thin line. Then he asked calmly for access to the raw data. Protocol required Elian to grant it. Refusal would be louder than an alarm bell. Elian transferred the package, his fingers moving without hesitation while his pulse hammered. The data he provided contained adjusted figures, smooth and plausible. It did not contain the original anomaly. Still, Elian knew the danger. A skilled eye could sense what had been smoothed. A deep probe might catch a subtle statistical wobble, a correlation that felt too clean. The seer's expression did not change as he received the data. That, more than anything, terrified Elian. A man who reacted too little usually reacted later, in ways that mattered. Hours passed after the ceremony, with ritual and formal praise filling the public halls. In private, the seer requested a meeting. The king attended with the same cold composure he brought to war councils. Elian stood beside the monarch like a shadow, aware that his own life depended on every sentence. The seer voiced his unease without accusation. He could not name a specific error, but he said the pattern looked polished, too neatly aligned as if someone had pressed down rough edges. He spoke as a man who had seen truth buried under perfect numbers before. The king listened with a controlled face, then turned to Elian. The question in his eyes was not medical. It was ownership. Explain this disturbance without making it real. Elian offered a defense built from plausible fragments, variations in data collection, minor calibration differences caused by ambient ward interference, the influence of the queen's foreign lineage complicating the resonance harmonics. He promised additional monitoring. He offered less invasive tests. He layered technical certainty over the seer's instinct until the instinct sounded like superstition. The king chose convenience. Accepting the result preserved stability. Questioning it publicly risked chaos, and chaos was the one thing he refused to allow. He dismissed the seer with polite restraint and a promise of continued oversight, as if the matter were closed by royal will. But not everyone in the palace believed in closure. In the shadows of the council chamber, the king's spy master watched the exchange with predator patience. Lady Kestrel's face gave nothing away. Her eyes did not linger on the king or the foreign seer. They lingered on Elian, on his calm posture, on the way his fingers rested too lightly on the edge of the table, as if ready to flee. She had spent her career collecting the small signs that preceded collapse. Elian had been invisible to her for years, important but uninteresting. Now, for the first time, he felt her attention settle like a blade laid across the back of his neck. On paper, the heir's legitimacy was confirmed. In ink and ceremony, the kingdom had been reassured. In reality, the palace had shifted onto a foundation of altered numbers, uneasy glances, and instincts that would not sleep. Elian returned to his tower that night and stared at the Queen's latest readings pinned on the wall. The data looked perfect. Too perfect. Beyond the parchment, inside the Queen, living evidence continued to grow, indifferent to codices and ceremonies. Paper lies, Elian understood, could hold only so long against a body that would eventually be born. As the pregnancy advanced, the Queen's body became contested territory. It carried the kingdom's hope, and it carried the risk of exposure. Rumors moved through the palace the way smoke moved through stone, finding hairline cracks no one admitted were there. Servants whispered about how often the captain of the guard stood at the Queen's door. They whispered about how the king spent more nights in his war room than in his wife's chambers, as if strategy could replace intimacy and still produce stability. Elian refused to chase whispers. He clung to what could be measured. The Queen's blood pressure began to fluctuate in small, troubling waves. Her sleep turned restless, broken by vivid dreams that left her scent sharp with fear before she even spoke. Her appetite shifted unpredictably. Yet the fetus thrived, heartbeat strong and regular under Elian's careful monitoring, growing with stubborn certainty as if the child had made an unspoken decision to live. Each steady thud complicated Elian's internal calculus. The more alive the child became, the harder it was to imagine any solution that ended with silence in the womb. Every time he placed a listening disc against the Queen's abdomen and heard that rhythm, something inside him tightened and whispered, "Not this one." Not a child sacrificed to protect adult pride. The court, however, did not deal in tenderness. It dealt in symbols. Omens began to appear in the palace conversation like stains that could not be washed out. A candle in the chapel guttered and flared, and priests argued whether it meant divine favor or warning. A raven landed on the east balcony, stared into the Queen's window, and refused to fly away until a guard chased it off. A seamstress claimed she had pricked her finger on the same needle 3 times while sewing the cradle linens. Small, ordinary events were fed into the court's hunger for meaning, and meaning always became leverage. Elian watched the Queen absorb those stories like poison in slow droplets. Her composure held in public, but in private, her hands began to move differently, protective and tense. One night, after a particularly violent storm, she gripped Elian's sleeve with a sudden urgency. "Promise me," she whispered, voice thin, the words almost breaking. "Promise the child will not be taken." Elian could not promise what the palace could always break. He answered with the only truth he was allowed. "I will keep you both alive." Even that felt like daring fate. Threats shifted from abstract politics to concrete danger. One afternoon, a tray of imported fruit arrived as a diplomatic gift from a distant ally. The note attached was dripping with praise and hope for the royal heir, written in the ornate hand of someone who understood court performance. The Queen's maid, trained by protocol and instinct, insisted Elian inspect it before it reached her mistress. He did so with a disciplined routine, testing for common contaminants. At first, the readings looked clean. Then he noticed a faint reaction in one sample that should have remained inert. The toxin was subtle, designed to move slowly, to pass through the placenta and accumulate in fetal tissue. It would not kill quickly. It would steal the pregnancy late, turning joy into stillness near the end, easily blamed on nature. Elian felt cold spread through his limbs as he confirmed it with a second test. This was not an impulsive attempt. This was knowledge applied with intent. Someone wanted the heir gone without leaving a clear handprint. He ordered the tray removed under a benign pretense, blaming spoilage from travel, and carried the findings himself to Lady Kestrel. The spymaster listened without expression, eyes sharp as cut glass. She did not ask how he recognized the compound. She did not praise him. Praise would have been intimacy, and intimacy was dangerous. She only said, quietly, "You have good eyes, physician." and that line felt like a chain settling around his wrist. From that day, attempts followed in different forms, spaced carefully enough to resemble coincidence. An apothecary tried to substitute one of the Queen's tonics with a slightly altered formula. The change was so small it would have passed unnoticed by anyone who did not memorize the Queen's regimen like scripture. Elian caught it by scent and a barely perceptible shift in viscosity, and his hands remained steady as he discarded the tainted bottle. A servant lingered too long near a stairwell at the precise moment the Queen was scheduled to descend, as if waiting for a stumble that would look like fate. Rowan's men moved the servant aside with polite firmness, and later that servant vanished from the palace without explanation. There was a near accident with the Queen's carriage harness during a courtyard transfer. A strap had been weakened, just enough to snap under sudden strain. Rowan inspected it personally afterward, his face hard, his scent stripped to cold discipline. The palace recorded it as wear and tear. Elian recorded it as intention. Each time, vigilance broke the chain. Either Elian's attention to detail or Rowan's presence interrupted the moment just before it became tragedy. Success should have brought relief. Instead, it deepened Elian's dread. Someone was moving against the pregnancy with patience. Someone believed the child was a threat worth killing, and Elian could not ignore the possibility that the target was not only the heir, but the secret inside the heir. Rowan began to appear in Elian's tower more often. Officially, he came for updates and to coordinate security measures. He asked about the Queen's rest, her stress levels, which corridors she walked, which foods were safest. Unofficially, their conversations lasted longer than necessary. They began with logistics and ended with shared silence in which neither dared to name the deeper fear. Elian noticed changes in Rowan that he would have documented in a patient. He slept less. His jaw clenched more often. His scent carried an edge that sharpened after each attempted sabotage, a barely contained violence directed at an enemy he could not openly hunt. Yet when he spoke about the Queen, the hardness shifted into something more careful, more personal, as if his discipline existed to protect a feeling he refused to admit even to himself. One night, after another intercepted substitution in the Queen's tonics, Rowan stood near Elian's work table, eyes fixed on the instruments, voice rough with restraint. "They will not stop," Rowan said. Elian did not argue. He only answered quietly, "Then we cannot afford to be tired." For a moment, Rowan's composure cracked just enough to show what lived under the armor. "If I fail," he murmured, and the words stopped there, unfinished, because finishing them would make them too real. Elian's pulse throbbed in his throat. "You will not," he said, and the certainty in his voice surprised them both. Outside the tower, the king tightened his grip on the realm. He sensed enemies moving, though he misread their true target. He believed they sought to destabilize his rule through assassination or war. He ordered doubled patrols, harsher interrogations, more eyes in every corridor. The court became a maze of suspicion. Every misstep, every late report, every unusual request was noted. The pressure of control increased until even ordinary breathing felt monitored. Elian and Rowan operated within that tightening net, each move calculated to appear routine while steering the Queen away from danger. Elian adjusted schedules so she moved only at unpredictable hours. Rowan rerouted guard rotations so the Queen's door was never watched by the same men 2 nights in a row. They used the palace's own obsession with protocol as camouflage because protocol created blind spots. Each prevented attempt eased one kind of fear and fed another. The more they succeeded, the more deeply they became entangled in a secret that would destroy them if exposed. And the child continued to grow, silent, relentless proof that no amount of paper reassurance could erase living blood. Elian began to understand that the hardest part was not stopping the threats that came from outside. It was surviving the moment when the truth inside the Queen would no longer be hidden by stone, magic, or rewritten logs. As the Queen entered her final month, the palace began preparing the next phase of the royal narrative as if it were a play already written. Tailors stitched tiny garments embroidered with the kingdom's emblem. Priests rehearsed blessings for a child whose title was chosen before the child's face existed in the world. Officials drafted proclamations and arranged a procession route through the inner courtyards. Factions adjusted their positions quietly, counting favors and debts they intended to collect the moment the heir arrived. In the quiet between these preparations, storms gathered in places that could not be seen from balconies. The king summoned Elian for increasingly frequent private consultations, each one framed as concern, each one sharpening into interrogation. He demanded guarantees no physician could honestly give, and he did it with the cold patience of a man who believed he could crush uncertainty by staring at it long enough. His questions grew more pointed, circling closer to the subject of paternity without naming it. He asked about anomalies that could appear late, about traits that might emerge even when tests looked clean, about how often resonance systems failed. Elian answered with carefully constructed truths. The pregnancy remained stable. The Queen's indicators sat within expected parameters. No defects had been detected. He offered data, schedules, protocols, anything that sounded like control. More than once, after Elian left those meetings, he felt as if he had walked out of a room with no air. Lady Kestrel began to appear at the edges of these consultations like a shadow that did not belong to any lamp. She said little. She watched the king's narrowing patience, noted Elian's measured replies, and stored the tension behind her unreadable eyes. She was not yet certain what secret pulsed beneath the surface, but she knew it involved the physician, the queen, and the captain, because the palace's most dangerous truths always clustered around those who were both essential and expendable. On an evening when the sky turned the color of bruised metal, a storm rolled in from the sea and wrapped the palace in restless wind. Lanterns flickered in the corridors, tapestries stirred as if something moved behind them. Thunder arrived in slow waves that made the stones seem to breathe. Elian returned to the White Tower late, carrying fresh notes and a tightness in his chest that did not ease even after he locked his door. He checked the Queen's latest readings again, then checked them again, as if repetition could change reality. The fetus's heartbeat remained steady, strong, stubborn. Each beat felt like a small refusal against everything waiting beyond the birth. A knock came after the lamps had burned lower. Rowan stood outside Elian's door without escort, without the pretense of a formal report. The captain's posture was controlled, but Elian saw the hairline fractures immediately. Stiffness in his movements, as if his muscles had been held too long in readiness. Shadows beneath his eyes. A faint tremor in his fingertips that he tried to hide by curling them into his palm. The man who had faced raids and attempted assassinations without flinching now looked like someone haunted by a threat no blade could cut. Elian let him in without speaking, because words felt too fragile for the night. They stood near the tower window, where rain streaked the glass and lightning carved brief wounds into the sky. Each thunderclap arrived like a verdict. Rowan did not pace. He remained still, but his scent carried strain that bled through discipline, the sharp edge of fear that had been forced into silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and rough, the kind of sound made by someone holding a scream behind his teeth. "Tomorrow," he said, and the single word carried everything he could not say. Elian watched him for a moment, then looked back out at the storm. "The palace will call it preparation," Elian murmured, "but it will feel like a cage." Rowan's jaw tightened. In the lightning's brief glare, the pale ring in one iris caught light like an omen. "If the child is harmed," he said, and his restraint made the sentence more dangerous than anger, "I will not survive it." Elian felt the line of those words settle into his bones. Rowan would accept exile, execution, dishonor. None of that was what truly terrified him. What terrified him was the possibility that the baby would be sacrificed to preserve the myth of royal purity, erased before it ever had the chance to cry. For the first time, Elian allowed himself to see Rowan not as a guard on the edge of duty, but as a man bound by the most brutal kind of love, the kind that demanded silence and still refused to die. Elian had been trying to shield everyone at once, the queen, the child, the crown, even his own fragile existence. The impossibility of that task pressed down until his shoulders ached. Someone would have to bear the visible cost. The question was, who would be made into a warning? The storm intensified. Rain struck the glass harder. Somewhere below, a bell rang once, not as celebration but as a signal that guards should close the outer gates. Elian's door opened again later, but this time it was not Rowan. Lady Kestrel entered without ceremony, as if doors were optional for her kind of authority. She carried no parchment, no visible evidence. She did not need it. Her mind was the archive. She spoke softly, and the softness made Elian's blood run colder. "Your records," she said, "show a sequence of recalibrations that do not match standard procedure." She listed details without raising her voice, altered timestamps, slight discrepancies between preliminary and public resonance outputs, a calibration signature that should have belonged to a different hand. She did not accuse him outright. She described what she had noticed and waited for his reaction the way a hunter waited for a heartbeat to betray prey. Elian remained still. He kept his expression neutral, because fear was a language Kestrel spoke fluently. Kestrel's gaze shifted briefly toward Rowan, then back to Elian. "You are protecting something," she said. "I do not yet know whether it protects the realm." Rowan's posture changed by a fraction, a subtle readiness that made the air sharpen. Elian felt trapped between them, the spymaster loyal to stability, the captain loyal to blood, and himself loyal to a child who had no vote in any of it. Elian's voice came out quieter than he intended. "If you pull the wrong thread," he said, "everything will burn." Kestrel's eyes did not widen. She only nodded once, as if confirming a suspicion. "Then tell me which thread," she replied, and the simplicity of it made Elian's stomach twist. She was not asking out of kindness. She was asking because she needed to decide what to sacrifice to keep the kingdom standing. Elian realized he could no longer live on borrowed time. The lie he had built in numbers was being approached from the outside, by someone who did not fear oaths or gods, only collapse. Kestrel was not an enemy like the king's temper. She was worse. She was loyal to the realm itself, not to the story told to sustain it. In the hours before dawn, 3 people in the palace fully understood the depth of the situation. Elian, whose hands held truth and falsehood in equal measure. Rowan, whose body was a weapon but whose fear was for a newborn life. Kestrel, whose patience could outlast any storm. Elsewhere, the queen lay awake in her chambers, sensing tension she could not name. She clutched her abdomen as if she could shield the child with her own hands and whispered prayers not to the public gods of the realm, but to any power listening in the dark. The night ended without resolution. The storm moved on, leaving the palace damp and quiet, as if nothing had happened. But the pressure remained, lodged in the walls, in the lungs, in the space between every breath, and when labor finally began, it did not wait for anyone to finish their calculations. Labor came with the second storm of the week. By afternoon, the sky outside the palace had turned almost black, and rain hammered the roofs like a war drum. In the queen's chambers, a different tempest took hold. Contractions began at wide intervals, then tightened into sharp, relentless waves that made the queen's breath fracture, and return, fracture, and return. Like a rope pulled too hard, Elian entered the room with hands that did not shake. He had learned long ago that the body could be terrified and still function if the mind clung to procedure. He directed midwives into positions, checked the queen's pulse, monitored her blood pressure, watched her scent for signs of panic that could endanger the child. He managed the delicate balance between pain relief and clarity, because the queen needed enough strength to push and enough awareness to survive. He had delivered heirs before. He had watched noble houses cheer and weep over tiny lungs beginning to work. But never had he delivered a life that felt like a lit fuse. The queen's body fought and endured. Sweat soaked her hairline. Her knuckles went white against the sheets. She did not scream often, because she had been trained by court life to hold everything inside. But when the pain peaked, her voice slipped out in short, raw sounds that made the midwives look away. "Not now," she gasped once, not as command but as prayer. "Please." Elian leaned close and kept his voice steady. "Breathe. Hold. Again." Outside the door, Rowan stood at his assigned post, barred from entering by decorum and by the king's explicit orders. His role, officially, was to guard against external threats while the inner circle handled the birth. Unofficially, every muffled sound that escaped the chamber carved new marks into him. Elian could not see him, but he could feel the captain's presence through the way the guards in the corridor moved more carefully, as if they were standing near a storm they could not name. The king waited in a nearby chamber, refusing to leave but refusing to show vulnerability. He paced with measured steps, each turn of his heel controlled. Messengers carried updates in clipped phrases, dilation progressing, no distress detected, fetal heartbeat strong. Each report soothed one fear and stoked another. Elian imagined the king's mind already selecting which outcome would preserve power and which outcome would require blood. Hours passed in layered exhaustion. The queen's body reached the final threshold. Her breathing turned ragged. Her eyes went distant, then snapped back with stubborn focus as another contraction took her. Elian felt the baby's descent under his hands and guided it through the last narrow passage of bone and muscle with practiced control. Then the child emerged with a rush of fluid and a cry that cut through the storm. In that first moment, Elian thought only in clinical terms. Clear the airway, check the chest rise, assess reflexes. The newborn protested the brutal transition from warmth to air with shrill cries and furious kicks, strong lungs, good color, alive. Relief hit Elian like sudden heat, sharp and almost painful. Then he saw the face. At first glance, it could have belonged to any royal infant, features still swollen and soft, eyes squeezed shut against the chamber's lamplight. Elian wrapped the child quickly, hands moving with the instinct of a man who knew he had seconds, not minutes. As he lifted the bundle to check the pupils, the newborn's eyelids fluttered open. Lightning struck outside, a sudden white flash that turned the room into a frozen portrait. One eye, dark and slate deep, stared up with newborn fury. The other held a pale ring around the iris, a rare trait that did not exist anywhere in the king's recorded ancestry, a mark so specific that it felt less like coincidence and more like a signature. Elian knew that ring. He had seen it in torchlight and morning sun, in training yard dust and corridor shadow. He had documented its genetic marker years ago in a file that should have remained a footnote. Now it stared back at him from a face barely formed, his breath caught despite himself. For a heartbeat, the chamber narrowed. The queen saw it too. Her head lifted weakly from the pillow, eyes heavy with exhaustion, and when she focused on the child, her expression shifted in a way that had nothing to do with royal composure. Joy rose first, instinctive and fierce, and then terror followed like a blade pressed to the throat. Her hand reached toward the baby's face and stopped midway, trembling. In that pause, Elian saw something else, something private and dangerous, a love so sharp it did not care what the palace demanded. Elian acted on instinct. He adjusted his grip and turned the child's face slightly away from the nearest midwife. He wrapped the swaddling tighter, layering cloth in a way that covered more than warmth required. His voice cut through the room, calm but absolute. Clear the space, only necessary hands. Bring fresh cloths. Move. The midwives obeyed because they were trained to obey the physician's tone and because fear in the room had become tangible. Elian's mind raced through options. The eye could not be unseen. It could only be delayed. A thin strip of soft bandage lay among the linens, used to protect delicate newborn skin from drafts. Elian applied it with practiced speed beneath the pretense of shielding sensitive tissue from the cold, laying it in a way that partially covered the marked eye. The baby protested, a louder cry, but the bandage held. Easy, Elian murmured, more to himself than anyone. Just for now. Word still traveled through the palace faster than reason. The king demanded entry the moment the birth was confirmed. When he stepped into the chamber, the infant was already swaddled, most features hidden by cloth and positioning. Elian presented the child in a way that emphasized everything that could not be argued. Strong lungs, steady breathing, healthy color, reflexes sharp. Facts, not faces. For a moment, the king's expression softened into something close to relief. He stepped nearer, touched the child's cheek with a hand more used to gripping steel. The gesture looked almost tender, almost human, and the sight of it made Elian's stomach twist. Tenderness could turn into violence faster than anger when pride was involved. The king did not notice the bandage, or if he did, he accepted the explanation offered by the room's exhaustion and protocol. He stared at the child as if searching for confirmation that the kingdom's story had been saved. The baby's cries quieted into small, fierce breaths, and the king nodded once, as if satisfied. Elian knew the deception could not hold. The pale ring would become more obvious as the child grew, as the eyes settled into their final color. Cloth and positioning could buy hours, maybe days, not years, but in that first hour, when decisions about life and death were made in shock and fatigue, time itself was a weapon. Elian used it. Outside, the storm began to relent. Rain softened against the roof. Thunder moved farther away. The sky cleared by degrees, as if the world wanted to pretend it had finished raging. Inside the palace, another storm began, quieter and more lethal, a storm of glances and instincts and truths that could no longer be fully buried beneath stone, ink, or cloth. In the hours after the birth, the palace existed in two parallel realities. In the outer one, messengers carried news of a successful delivery. Bells rang in measured celebration. Kitchens began preparing feasts as if joy could be cooked and served. Courtiers rehearsed congratulatory phrases and adjusted their faces into suitable devotion. In the inner one, a handful of people stood over a newborn like witnesses at a crime scene, listening to the quiet breaths of living evidence. The queen lay pale but upright, held together by will more than strength. The child rested against her, warm and stubborn, the tiny body already seeking comfort by scent and heartbeat. The bandage over the marked eye looked harmless to anyone who did not know what it concealed. To Elian, it felt like a thin wall between survival and massacre. Rowan was not allowed inside the chamber by protocol, but Kestrel made protocol bend. She had guards placed at both ends of the corridor under the pretense of increased security. She ensured no curious servant entered. She ensured the king was kept occupied by public congratulations and official reports long enough for private truth to be measured. Kestrel insisted on seeing the child. When she entered, her movements were calm, but her attention was sharp enough to cut. Elian loosened the bandage with fingers that remained steady only because they had learned to be steady or die. The newborn blinked, confused by light, and then the eye turned toward them, revealing the pale ring around the iris like a seal stamped in flesh. Kestrel's reaction was not shock. It was confirmation. Her jaw tightened, and her gaze flicked once toward the door as if she could already hear consequences approaching. She had suspected a hidden fracture in the palace's story. Now the fracture had a face. The queen watched Kestrel's expression with a kind of exhausted calm. She had already made her own peace with the truth in the moment she saw the child's eyes. The terror had passed. What remained was something sharper. Decision. Elian felt the room shrink under the weight of options that were not really options at all. They laid themselves out with brutal clarity. If the king saw the marked eye and recognized it, the consequences would be immediate and lethal. The queen would be accused of adultery and treason. Rowan would be executed without trial, worthy of the word. Elian would be interrogated until confession was extracted, whether it was true or not. The baby would either be killed as a threat or kept alive as a political hostage, raised in a gilded cage where every breath would be monitored for future utility. The scandal would not only destroy a household, it would fracture the kingdom. Rival houses would rally around the stain, foreign courts would exploit it, and stability would turn into bloodshed. If the king never learned, the lie would have to be maintained not just in records but in daily life. The child would be raised as heir to a man who was not his biological father. The palace would watch the baby's face for resemblance, like predators watching for weakness. Rowan would remain at court, forced to guard the corridors while his son grew under another man's name. Elian would carry the knowledge as a permanent strain on his conscience and his safety. The lie would survive until the day it did not, and that day would be worse because it would arrive after the child had become real to the realm. There was a third option, unthinkable and yet solidifying in the space between the queen's breaths. It would mean sacrificing the crown's obsession with purity to preserve actual lives. It would mean engineering a disappearance so complete that the king could mourn without suspecting betrayal, while the child lived beyond the palace's reach. The queen, who had spent her life treated as a political instrument, surprised Elian more than Kestrel did. Her voice was weak, but the authority inside it came from something deeper than title. "My child will not be a weapon," she said. The words were simple. They landed like a verdict. She did not speak of honor. She did not plead for forgiveness. She spoke of survival and dignity. She understood the king loved the concept of an heir more than he loved her or the baby as individuals. She also understood something colder. If the king believed fate had denied him an heir through tragedy, he would rage and grieve, but his fury would turn outward, toward enemies, toward the gods, toward the borders. He would not immediately turn it inward on his own household, because doing so would mean admitting the palace itself was the source of ruin. Kestrel saw the cruel logic at once. Her loyalty was to the realm as a living organism, not to the king's pride. A narrative of tragic loss could preserve stability long enough to keep the kingdom from eating itself. And stability in Kestrel's world was not sentimental. It was survival. The plan formed in layers, fast and ruthless. Officially, the queen would be reported to have suffered a sudden complication. The child would be declared stillborn. The palace would mourn. The court would cry and then recalibrate, already preparing to pressure the queen into another pregnancy when her body healed. A public loss would preserve the king's image and redirect suspicion outward. Privately, the real child would disappear. Elyan understood the monstrous practicalities immediately. The king would demand proof. The council would demand ritual confirmations. There would need to be a body, because courts did not accept emptiness. Kestrel spoke about the necessity with a clinical lack of emotion that made Elyan's throat tighten. She could procure a stillborn infant from outside the palace, someone lost to poverty and distance, someone no one powerful would miss. She could disguise it enough for the king's grief-blinded eyes, enough for hurried rites, enough for sealed burial. The queen listened without flinching. Her hand tightened around the newborn swaddling, and for a moment Elyan saw her struggle not to sob, not to let emotion loosen her grip on the only thing that mattered. Rowan, when he was allowed into the chamber under Kestrel's protection, took one look at the child and went still. The newborn's marked eye was visible now, undeniable. Rowan's face did not break into joy. It hardened into fear and love welded together. "No," he rasped, the single word tearing out of him. "Not like this." The queen lifted her gaze to him, and the look she gave carried years of shared understanding compressed into one moment. She had been placed into a loveless marriage, a symbol traded between kingdoms. Rowan had sworn to protect her, and could not protect her from that. But he could protect what their forbidden moments had created. "You will go," she said, voice low, iron beneath weakness. "You will keep him alive." Rowan's throat worked as if he were swallowing something that could not go down. His hands hovered over the child, and then closed gently, as if he feared his touch might bruise fate itself. Elyan felt something inside him crack. The queen was choosing to live publicly as a queen who had failed at her most sacred duty, while privately knowing her child existed somewhere beyond her reach. She was choosing separation as mercy. It was a sacrifice larger than any crown should demand, yet she offered it without hesitation. Kestrel outlined the final layer. Elyan and Rowan would vanish with the child. Their deaths would be staged, believable in a kingdom already tense with border unrest. A fire, an ambush on a road, a collapsed bridge, something that left little recoverable evidence. Kestrel would manage the trail, ensuring that any investigation stopped at a plausible conclusion. The queen would play her role, grieving in public so convincingly that even the king's suspicion would dull under his own pain. Elyan realized the choice he had been dreading, whom to save, had been partially made for him. The queen had chosen the child over the crown and over her own heart. Now it was his turn to decide whether he would risk everything to execute her command. He looked at the newborn, at the tiny fist curling and uncurling with instinctive insistence, at the marked eye that would one day become either a death sentence or a reason to run faster. "I will," Elyan said, and the words came out hoarse, more vow than statement. For the first time in his life, he stepped into a role not chosen for him by the palace, by debt, or by birth. He chose it himself. The days that followed became a blur of orchestrated grief and covert preparation, layered so tightly that even Elyan sometimes felt as if he were watching someone else move through his own life. The official story swept through the palace with suspicious speed, as if it had been waiting for a moment to become real. A sudden turn in labor, a tragic complication. Despite the best efforts of the royal Omega physician, the infant heir had been born without breath. The palace mourned on schedule. Bells rang in a slower cadence, black cloth appeared on railings and doorframes, candles multiplied in chapels. Courtiers spoke in soft voices, eyes shining with rehearsed sorrow and private calculation. Priests offered prayers that sounded more like politics than comfort. Foreign envoys sent condolences written in elegant ink, already measuring what the loss would change. Inside the Queen's chambers, grief was a weapon they used to shield the truth. The king's reaction was as violent as they had feared. He shattered a ceremonial goblet against the wall, its pieces skittering over stone like insects. He cursed the gods, cursed his enemies, cursed fate itself. In one private moment, his gaze landed on the Queen with a sharpness that almost became accusation, because it was easier to blame a body than to accept the world's refusal. But when he saw her lying weak and tear-streaked, hair damp against her temples, clutching a lifeless swaddled form that was not actually their child, his anger shifted. It found a safer target in the invisible forces he had always believed hunted him: rival nobles, foreign courts, hidden traitors. He was a man built to direct violence outward. That instinct saved the Queen for now. Elyan played his part in the public narrative with the same clinical discipline he used in medicine. He looked exhausted. He spoke quietly. He offered measured statements about unavoidable complications and merciless chance. He remained at the Queen's bedside, devoting himself to her recovery, because that was what a dutiful physician did when a kingdom needed someone to blame without tearing its own structure apart. His real work unfolded below the palace, in the passageways that smelled of damp stone and old ash. Kestrel set a strict timetable and enforced it like law. Nothing about the escape could be improvisation. A carriage was prepared under cover of night, not marked with royal insignia, but made to look like a simple supply run. It was stocked with unremarkable travel gear, plain cloth, water, food that would not spoil quickly. Kestrel arranged forged documents, stamped with seals that would pass a tired guard's glance. She arranged a route that avoided main roads and royal checkpoints. She arranged silence. Elyan gathered what he could carry without arousing suspicion: medical supplies small enough to hide in common satchels, a few precious texts that could make the difference between life and death in a village without trained healers, dried herbs, a compact set of instruments wrapped in cloth, and the child, the real baby, slept against Elyan's chest, wrapped tight, warm and heavy in a way that felt both sacred and terrifying. The newborn did not know that grief was being performed above him, that a false body lay in royal cloth while the true heir breathed quietly beneath a plain cloak. Elyan listened to each tiny breath as if counting it could protect it. Rowan shed his gleaming captain's armor for sturdy, plain leather. Without insignia and uniform, he looked less like the king's blade and more like any hardened soldier on the fringes of the realm. Only his posture gave him away, the way he scanned every shadow, the way his attention moved in controlled sweeps, always measuring distance to the nearest exit. They could not say goodbye to the Queen in any way that resembled a farewell. Kestrel allowed only a brief moment in a secluded alcove near an unused stairwell, away from prying eyes and listening servants. The Queen arrived supported by a maid who knew only what she needed to know. Her skin still carried the pallor of childbirth, her steps slow, but her gaze was sharp enough to cut through stone. She reached for the baby with trembling fingers. Elyan hesitated, then gave the bundle into her arms. For a few seconds the Queen held her child without crown, without court, without performance. Her mouth parted as if she might speak the baby's name, then she closed it again, because names were chains. The newborn's eyes opened once. The marked eye caught the dim light. The Queen's breath hitched like a suppressed sob. She traced the baby's cheek as if trying to memorize the exact curve, the texture, the warmth, committing it to a memory she would be forced to live on. "Live," she whispered, a single word that sounded like both blessing and order. Rowan stood close, rigid, as if movement might shatter what little time they had. When the Queen looked up at him, something passed between them that did not need language. Years of duty. One forbidden truth. A child that would now become the price of everything. Elyan took the baby back. The Queen did not ask for more time. That restraint broke Elyan more than tears could have. Then they left. Their departure was disguised as routine. The carriage moved out through a service gate with supplies and paperwork that looked ordinary. Guards waved them through with bored eyes, because boredom was the palace's greatest blind spot. Kestrel's influence smoothed the path in quiet ways. A reassigned patrol here, a delayed report there, a messenger sent in the wrong direction at the right time. It was not enough to leave. They had to vanish so completely that any pursuit would find only dead ends. Halfway toward the borderlands, the staged attack occurred exactly as Kestrel had written it. A decoy carriage, identical in build and paint, took the route that would be watched. Bandits, real or purchased, struck it at dusk. Fire consumed wood quickly. Smoke rose into the sky like a signal. Bodies were left in the wreckage, 2 men of similar build already dead from other causes, dressed in enough recognizable remnants to satisfy a casual inspection. A ring, a strip of cloth bearing a familiar stitch, the kind of proof that closed investigations when people wanted closure. In reality, Elian and Rowan watched the flames from a wooded hillside, the baby tucked safely between them. The firelight threw Rowan's face into sharp relief, and Elian saw not the king's guard, but a man severing his last official tie to the life he had known. Rowan did not speak. His eyes followed the burning carriage as if he were watching a funeral for himself. Elian's hands tightened around the child. The baby stirred, made a small sound, then settled again. That quiet breath cut through the crackle of fire and made the choice feel absolute. The road beyond the staged ambush led them into country neither of them knew well. Villages grew smaller. Roads became dirt tracks. Accents softened and shifted. People spoke more about harvests and weather than about dynasties. The king's banners appeared less often, then vanished entirely. With each mile, Elian felt the phantom weight of the White Tower lift from his shoulders. In its place, a new weight settled, heavier because it was chosen. Responsibility for a child who would grow up far from palace lies. Responsibility for the truth that could never be fully told without killing someone. By the time they crossed into a region where the royal colors no longer hung from gates, the royal Omega physician and the king's captain no longer existed in any record that mattered. In their place traveled a quiet healer with careful hands, his companion with a soldier's stance, and a baby whose future would be written beyond the reach of courts. Behind them, the palace mourned a dead heir. Ahead of them, the living one breathed. Years later, the story told in the capital sounded clean enough to be carved into stone. The queen had lost her first child and never conceived again. The royal physician who had failed her died in an ambush while traveling to aid a distant garrison. The captain of the guard perished alongside him, a tragic waste of loyalty and skill. The king, worn down by grief and external pressure, turned his attention fully to war and diplomacy, as if conquest could fill the hollow place an heir had left behind. No one in the palace spoke about the brief rumor that a few witnesses had seen something strange in the eyes of the stillborn infant, a flicker of unusual color that did not fit the royal line. Those who remembered dismissed it as stormlight and exhaustion. Those who had spoken of it too openly learned to value silence. Time did what time always did in courts. It buried inconvenient details under newer disasters, newer feasts, newer betrayals. The queen survived within the narrative, but the queen as a person drifted into a smaller life. People said she grew more devout. They said she gave more to charity. They said she wore grief like a second crown, heavier and more honest than gold. In public portraits, her smile faded year by year, replaced by calm restraint, the expression of someone who had learned that joy could be used as evidence. The king aged faster than his years. He became a man who trusted fewer people and punished more quickly. He sharpened borders and tightened taxes. He built monuments to strength while the line of succession weakened like an old rope. Noble houses began to maneuver, quietly at first, then openly, trying to place distant cousins into the shadow of the throne. Alliances grew brittle. The realm remained intact, but it felt different, like a structure held together by vigilance rather than faith. Lady Kestrel remained in the palace's veins, unseen and indispensable. Some whispered she was the only reason the kingdom had not fractured into civil war. Others feared her and called her a spider. Both were correct in different ways. She understood that kingdoms were not held by love or honor. They were held by secrets managed correctly. Far from the capital, beyond the reach of banners and proclamations, a valley existed where mountains broke the wind into soft currents. A small settlement thrived around a crossroads. Travelers knew it for the reliability of its inn, the steadiness of its roads, and the quiet skill of a healer whose hands never hesitated even when a wound looked hopeless. The healer was known simply as Elian. He lived in a cottage that smelled of herbs and wood smoke instead of incense. His shelves held jars of dried leaves, roots, and powders gathered from the valley slopes. His ledger was no longer locked with spell and key. It lay open on a work table with simple names: farmers, merchants, children, old men who coughed through winter and swore they would not see another spring. He treated injuries that had nothing to do with crowns. He stitched a shepherd's torn palm. He set broken bones after cart accidents. He delivered babies who would never be weighed for political value. In those moments, when a newborn cried into the world and a mother wept from relief rather than fear of court judgment, Elian sometimes felt a quiet ache, not pain exactly, but a reminder of what had been stolen from one woman in a palace. A man lived with him who the village called a mercenary. Rowan accepted the title because it explained his presence without inviting questions. He took contracts to keep the roads clear of brigands. He escorted caravans when rumors of bandits rose. He trained local youths in basic defense, not to make them soldiers, but to teach them how to stand, how to breathe, how to keep fear from turning their legs to water. Rowan never fully shed the habits of a captain. He scanned strangers the way a man scanned ambush points. He placed himself instinctively between danger and the cottage door. He spoke little in public, but his silence carried authority. The valley respected him without understanding why. Between them, a boy grew. His name carried no royal legacy and no dynastic expectation. To the villagers, he was simply a bright child with a stubborn streak, quick hands, and an impatience for being told what he could not do. He climbed trees too high. He asked questions adults did not like. He built imagined kingdoms out of stones and twigs, arranging them in patterns that looked like fortifications when seen from above. His eyes made people look twice. One was deep and steady, dark as wet stone. The other held a pale ring around the iris that caught sunlight in a peculiar way. Strangers sometimes stared too long, then forced a laugh and looked away, as if embarrassed by their own curiosity. Elian watched the boy move through the garden and felt the bittersweet pull of memory. Sometimes, when the child frowned in concentration or laughed with sudden fierceness, a ghost of the queen's expression passed across his face. In those moments, Elian's chest tightened with grief for what she had given up and gratitude that her sacrifice had not been wasted. Rowan taught the boy to hold a wooden sword, correcting his stance with patient firmness. He did not train him to serve any throne. He trained him to know his own body, to find balance, to understand that strength could be quiet. When the boy succeeded in a difficult movement, Rowan's pride flashed through his restraint like sunlight through cloud. Again, Rowan would say, the single word turning practice into ritual. At first, the boy treated it as a game. Later, as he grew older, he treated it as something more serious, though he could not have explained why. He only knew that when Rowan's hand adjusted his shoulder, he felt steadier. When Elian checked his scraped knees and murmured calm reassurances, he felt safe. His world was small, but it was consistent, and consistency is the first language of love. News from the capital reached the crossroads occasionally, carried by merchants who enjoyed the inn's warmth. They spoke of a king whose temper had sharpened, of nobles arguing over succession, of border tensions flaring and cooling like fever. They spoke of a queen who rarely appeared in public now, devoting herself to charity and religious work, lighting candles in the palace chapel until wax pooled like tears. Elian listened without reacting. He asked the right questions, offered neutral comments, and stored details the way he once stored medical data. He never revealed his past. He never let the merchant see his hands tighten around his mug when the queen was mentioned. He imagined her in that chapel, eyes down, face calm, and wondered if she ever pictured a valley she had never seen, where her child ran free under open sky. At night, when the boy slept and the cottage grew quiet, Elian sometimes sat by the fire with Rowan nearby. Their bond had grown without grand declarations. It was built from years of shared danger, small domestic tasks, and the constant silent agreement to put the child's safety above everything. Their relationship did not fit any title the court would have recognized. It did not need to. It had the simple truth of survival turned into home. Elian thought back to the resonance chamber beneath the White Tower, to the moment his life first cracked open. He had believed then his choice was between the baby, the crown, and his own survival. In the end, the crown had been the thing reshaped, forced to continue without what it demanded most. It remained distant and altered, still ruling people who would never know how close it had come to breaking. In the valley, a different kind of kingdom existed. It had no banners and no subjects. It had no throne. It was held together by trust instead of law, by daily acts of care instead of proclamations, by two men who had once been expendable pieces in someone else's story and had become the authors of their own. Sometimes, when the boy fell asleep by the fire and the wind moved softly through the trees, Elian let himself believe that this was what loyalty looked like when stripped of ceremony. Not obedience to stone rules, not devotion to a crown, but the willingness to break the rules written in blood so that a child could live without being turned into evidence. If you listen to this story all the way to the end, remember that titles can be assigned, revoked, and rewritten, but choices remain. Write in the comments whose decision felt strongest to you. The Queen, who sacrificed her place in her child's life. Rowan, who abandoned everything he had been to protect a future no one would ever acknowledge. Or Elian, who walked away from the tower and chose a life built on truth instead of duty. Do not forget to support the channel with a like and a subscription so you do not miss the next Forbidden BL story about how even the most dangerous secrets can lead not only to ruin, but to a quiet, honest kind of love.